Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something really interesting, actually. It's called the universal swing score.
That's right.
Imagine like a single number that tells you how good your golf swing is. Not just feel, but, actual data.
Exactly. It's a new metric, been developed over the last few months. And what's really compelling is that it's already showing a pretty strong link to scoring average and
How?
handicap,
What?
real world results.
Yeah, and we've got the info straight from the source of the announcement, a webinar they did. So we're going to give you the shortcut, basically.
hmm
Get you up to speed quickly.
Our goal here is just to unpack it. What is this swing score? How does it actually work? And maybe most importantly, why should you care if you want to improve your golf?
Right. And it boils down to three core things they look at: speed, efficiency, and consistency.
Speed, efficiency, consistency. Got it. And the data behind it. It comes from assessments using drivers or irons, and it's compared against this big database. I think that's over 250 unique swings now. And crucially, they have separate databases for drivers versus irons, and also for men versus women.
Oh, that's smart. So the comparisons are actually relevant.
Makes them much more meaningful, yeah.
Okay, let's dig into that first piece then. Speed. I guess it's not just about, like, raw power, is it?
No, not just swinging out of your shoes. It's about how you generate velocity effectively.
Mhm.
So the speed score looks at several aspects. A big one is rotational range of motion.
Okay, well, what measurements fall under that?
They track three main things.
Hmm.
How much your chest turns, max chest turn, how much your pelvis turns, max pelvis turn, and the difference between those two, which people often call the X factor or they term it X back max.
Right, the stretch across the core. And for tour players, these numbers are pretty big.
They are significant.
Mm.
For male pros, you're typically looking at around 100 degrees of chest turn, maybe 43 degrees of pelvis turn. That gives you that X factor of about 64 degrees.
And for women, similar.
Surprisingly close, yeah. Chest around 103, pelvis about 45, so an X factor near 63 degrees.
So why is that range of motion, that twist, so important? What's the payoff?
Well, think of it like winding up a spring or maybe stretching a rubber band. The more you can separate your upper body rotation from your lower body in the backswing,
Mm-hmm.
the more potential energy you store up. It's about pre-stretching the muscles, the fascia,
Right.
and that stored ossic energy is then available to unleash more force and speed in the downswing.
Makes total sense. More stretch, more snap. Okay, so that's the twisting part. But we also move side to side, don't we?
We do, and the score accounts for that under horizontal movement. Specifically, they track chest slide and pelvis slide,
Mm.
particularly during that transition phase from backswing to downswing. It's how much you shift laterally towards the target.
Okay. And how much slide are we talking for, say, the pros?
Interestingly, it's quite small and pretty consistent, usually around 1.4 to 1.5 inches for both chest and pelvis slide for men and women.
Just an inch and a half. That seems tiny.
It does sound small, but don't underestimate it. That little bit of lateral shift is actually vital. It helps sequence the downswing properly, helps you release the club correctly, get it on the right plane. It's about using the ground effectively sideways.
Okay. So twist, slide. What about up and down? The vertical movement? I see some players who look like they're almost jumping.
Exactly, and that's captured too. Vertically, they look at pelvis drop during the downswing and then pelvis lift into impact. And there's a really fascinating clear link between how much a golfer lifts their pelvis through impact and their clubhead speed.
Ah, so that using the ground idea again?
Very much so. You hear coaches sometimes talk about jumper patterns versus, say, leg buckle patterns.
Right, the jumpers really seem to push off. Yeah.
Yes. In that pattern, the pelvis tends to drop a bit, maybe early to mid downswing, and then powerfully lifts up into impact. They're really using vertical force. Some with more of a leg buckle might drop, but they don't get that same upward thrust, perhaps because their lead leg doesn't straighten as dynamically.
And what are the typical numbers there for tour players versus maybe those long drive guys?
Good question. Tour players typically show maybe around 2 inches of pelvis drop in the downswing and then about 3 inches of lift coming into impact. But a long drive competitor, they might drop closer to 4 inches and lift maybe 5 inches or even more.
Wow, big difference.
Huge difference. That extra vertical drive is a major source of their incredible speed. So understanding your own vertical signature can definitely reveal some power potential.
Got it. So rotation, slide, lift, these are all ways we create speed. Does the score also just measure raw rotational speeds?
Absolutely. That falls under rotational speed, logically enough.
Yeah.
They track the peak rotational speeds of the pelvis, the chest, the lead arms, and even the club shaft itself, usually measured in degrees per second.
And that connects directly to clubhead speed, I assume?
Directly. It's a measure of your rotational power. It stands to reason. The faster you can rotate those segments, the faster the club head is likely to move.
And this ties into that concept of the kinematic sequence, right? The order things fire in.
Precisely. We'll talk more about sequence under efficiency, but yes, the speeds are fundamental to it. Ideally, you want the pelvis to accelerate first, then the chest or torso, then the lead arm, and finally the club, like cracking a whip.
Right, that sequential buildup of speed.
Exactly. When that order gets jumbled, you tend to leak energy and lose speed.
Okay, makes sense. One last bit for the speed component, release. What's measured there?
For release, a key metric is the angle between the lead forearm and the club shaft, when the lead arm is parallel to the ground in the downswing.
Okay.
For tour guys, that's typically around 81 degrees. For women, maybe closer to 85 degrees. And importantly, this is a 3D measurement captured by the sensors, so it's much more accurate than just, say, looking at a 2D video.
Good point. And there was also something called wrist release percent. What's that about?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. If you imagine plotting the wrist angle throughout the downswing, it tends to decrease initially, more lag, and then increase rapidly as the club head is released. The wrist release percent basically tells you when that rapid increase, that straightening action, happens relative to the total time of your downswing.
So it's about the timing of the unhinging.
Exactly. And what the data tends to show is that players who can maintain that lag or delay that release a bit later into the downswing, they often generate higher club head speeds.
What are the typical percentages?
Tour average for men is around 36%, meaning the main release happens just past the first third of the downswing. For women, it's slightly earlier, around 33%. So that timing is another potential speed factor.
Okay, wow, that's a really thorough breakdown of everything feeding into the speed score.
It covers a lot of ground, yeah.
So let's move to the second pillar, efficiency. Speed is great, but you need to transfer it effectively, right?
Absolutely. Efficiency is all about how well you channel the energy you generate from the ground, up through the body, and ultimately into the club head. The kinematic sequence we touched on is a huge part of this, but we also look at specific gain factors at each sort of joint or segment link.
Gain factors, what are those?
They're basically ratios of the peak speeds between connected body segments. So you have a core gain factor, that's peak chest speed divided by peak pelvis speed.
Okay.
Then a shoulder gain factor, peak lead arm speed divided by peak chest speed. And a wrist gain factor, peak chest speed divided by peak lead arm speed.
So it shows how much speed is being amplified at each stage.
Precisely. You might see typical values like maybe a 1.9 for the core gain, 1.3 for the shoulder, maybe 2.0 for the wrist gain.
Yeah.
The average across them might be around 1.94 or so. Looking at these ratios can really highlight where you're good at multiplying speed and maybe where there's a weak link in the chain, like a slipping gear,
That's a great analogy, the slipping gear. Makes
Yeah.
sense. And related to that, I think, is percent contribution by joint.
Yes. This looks at the same segments, pelvis, core, shoulder, wrist, but asks, what percentage of the final club head speed can be attributed to the peak speed of each of those segments?
Ah, so it shows where the speed is primarily coming from.
Exactly. For instance, if you see a really high percentage contribution from the wrist, but maybe lower numbers from the pelvis and core,
It might suggest you're not using your lower body and trump efficiently, maybe relying too much on your hands and arms.
that's often the implication, yeah. It can be a powerful diagnostic for finding energy leaks or identifying if someone is, say, an armsy swinger versus using their whole body.
I can see how that would be useful. A lot of amateurs probably fall into that category. Okay, and then transition order. We mentioned the sequence for speed, but it's critical for efficiency too.
Absolutely critical. That ideal 1, 2, 3, 4 sequence, pelvis, then chest, then arm, then club peaking and speed, is the most efficient way to transfer momentum. It allows the body to maximize the stretch shorting cycles. We talked about the X factor stretch, the stretch across the shoulder, the lag in the wrists.
And getting the order wrong is inefficient.
Highly inefficient. If the arms or clubs start down before the lower body, for example, that's the classic over-the-top move. You lose the stretch, you lose the sequence, you lose power and accuracy.
Right.
And they're even adding more detail now, looking at the sequence within the pelvis movement itself in transition.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Looking at whether the pelvis sways laterally towards the target first, then starts rotating, then starts lifting. That fine-tuning of the initial move can also reveal efficiency gains or losses.
Fascinating. Okay, so we've covered speed generation and efficient energy transfer. That leaves the third pillar, consistency.
And Arguably, for scoring, this might be the most important one for many golfers.
Because it doesn't matter how fast or efficient your best swing is if you can't repeat it, right?
Exactly. Consistency, in the context of this score, isn't about comparing you to a tour pro's movements. It's about comparing you to you. How repeatable is your own swing pattern?
Okay, how do they measure that?
They look at the variability, technically, the standard deviation of your movements across multiple swings. Ideally, you'd capture maybe 10 or more swings for this. And they measure this variability at key points in the swing: address, the top of the backswing, transition, and impact.
So it's looking at how much things like my body angles or positions change from one swing to the next at those key moments.
Precisely. They track the standard deviation for things like your pelvis turn, bend, and side bend, your chest turn, bend, and side bend. Also positional things like chest sway and lift, pelvis sway and lift, even where your hands are in space at these key moments, and the timing of transition.
So a low standard deviation means low variability, high repeatability.
Correct. You're doing very similar things swing after swing. High standard deviation means, well, things are all over the place.
Which explains those days on the course where nothing seems to work consistently.
Doesn't it? And what's clever about the scoring here is that it's tailored.
Tailored how?
Well, a certain amount of variation in one metric might be less significant than the same amount of variation in another. For example, your chest turn at the top might naturally vary by a couple of degrees without much consequence. So a 2-degree standard deviation there might score quite well for consistency,
Okay.
but something like, say, pelvis side bend at impact, which has a much smaller functional range, a 1-degree variation there might actually be a bigger indicator of inconsistency and could score lower.
Ah, I see. So it weights the variability based on how much that specific movement should vary.
Exactly. It's based on research into which parameters are most critical to keep stable for consistent results. The ideal score for any consistency metric is, of course, 0 standard deviation, perfect repetition.
Right. And the report might show percentiles, but the actual score is based on these unique factors.
Yeah, the percentiles give you context, like your chest turn variability is lower than 80% of golfers. But the score itself uses a specific factor derived from research for each variable, reflecting its true importance for consistency. A stable hand path through impact, for example, might be weighted more heavily than slight variations in posture at address.
Okay, that paints a really clear picture. So bringing it all together, the universal swing score is this single number, but it's built from these 3 deep layers: speed, efficiency, and consistency.
That's the framework. Speed potential, how well you use it, and how often you can repeat it.
It sounds incredibly powerful for understanding where to focus your efforts.
It really is. And you can see how they interact, right? You might have speed but poor efficiency, or be efficient but wildly inconsistent. This allows for really targeted, data-driven guidance for players and coaches, and as we said, it correlates well with actual performance improvements.
So what's next for this? Is it going to become widely available?
That seems to be the plan. Expect to see the full reports rolling out more broadly, more features within the apps. They're also working on refining it for different types of swings, maybe different skill levels. And the big picture is likely integration into coaching platforms, maybe player subscriptions, things like that.
Any immediate next steps people can look out for?
Actually, yes. They mentioned a mobile app release happening this week, apparently. It sounds like it will include a version of the swing score, maybe not quite as detailed as the full reports we've discussed, but it will give you those top-line scores for speed, efficiency, and consistency right on your phone.
Oh, that's great. Instant feedback.
Yeah, should be really interesting to see how people use it.
Definitely. So as you're listening to all this, thinking about this deep dive we just did into the universal swing score, here's something to ponder. How might having this kind of really specific, quantifiable breakdown of your own swing, if you could get it, how might that change how you practice or what you focus on to improve?
Yeah, would you chase more speed first or work on smoothing out the energy transfer for efficiency?
Or would you zero in on just trying to repeat whatever you currently do, better focusing on consistency?
It really gives you a different lens to look through, doesn't it?
It certainly does. A lot to think about there. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive.